Right now, the average NFL franchise is worth more than $7.5 billion. That average has climbed from roughly $1 billion back in 2010 to where it sits today. Add up all 32 teams, and you're looking at a combined empire worth somewhere north of $200 billion. One league, 32 teams. More combined value than the GDP of most countries on Earth. Here's what almost nobody remembers. This entire operation started with a meeting inside a car dealership showroom in Canton, Ohio in 1920, where a handful of team owners scraped together enough cash to pay a $100 franchise fee. And most of those original teams didn't even survive their first decade. So how did a league that started broke in a Hupmobile dealership, with teams folding left and right, turn into the single most dominant business in professional sports? In this video, we're breaking down how the NFL actually built its $200 billion empire. The chaotic founding, the TV deal that changed everything, the merger that almost didn't happen, the labor war that built the modern salary cap, and the media rights arms race that's making the league more money than anyone thought possible. Let's get into it. In September 1920, a group of team representatives met in Canton, Ohio, and formed the American Professional Football Association, the organization that would eventually become the NFL. The meeting happened in the showroom of a car dealership because nobody had an office nicer than that. Franchise fee, $100. Most teams never actually paid it in full. The league had 14 teams that first year, and almost none of them looked anything like what exists today. Teams played in small industrial towns. Rosters overlapped with college players still using fake names to protect their eligibility. Jim Thorpe, one of the greatest athletes in American history, was named the league's first president, mostly because his name would sell tickets, not because anyone expected him to run a business. Teams folded constantly. Some played a single season and disappeared. Others existed for a few years and quietly dissolved when the gate money didn't cover the train fare. The league didn't even settle on the name National Football League until 1922, 2 years after it started. For its first decade, pro football was considered a distant, disreputable cousin of college football, which was the real spectacle in America at the time, filling actual stadiums with actual crowds. What kept the league alive in those early years was almost entirely stubbornness. A small handful of owners, men like George Hollis in Chicago, refused to let it die, plowing personal money into keeping their teams afloat year after year, waiting for the business to eventually make sense. Compare that scrappy origin to today, where the league office alone employs hundreds of people. Individual teams carry front office payrolls in the tens of millions of dollars, and a single franchise sale now requires a buyer to be able to write a check for billions before the league even lets him bid. The gap between 1920 and today isn't just growth, it's a completely different universe of business. The Great Depression should have killed professional football. Attendance cratered across the country, and a league that was already financially fragile had even less room for error. Instead, the 1930s became the decade the NFL actually started building the structural pieces that still exist today. In 1932, a Chicago team and a Portsmouth team finished the season tied, forcing the first ever championship game played indoors at Chicago Stadium because a blizzard made the outdoor field unusable. That game was popular enough that the league formally split into two divisions the following year, with a championship game to follow, giving pro football for the first time a real postseason narrative instead of just a standings table. In 1936, the league introduced the draft, a genuinely radical idea at the time. Instead of teams bidding against each other for the best college talent, the worst team from the previous season got the first pick. The idea was competitive balance. A rich team couldn't simply buy every good player, and it's a structural decision that still defines the league nearly a century later. The first draft ever held took place in a Philadelphia hotel and lasted a grand total of 9 rounds, with almost no fanfare and no cameras. Compare that to today, where the draft has become a multi-day primetime television event held in a different major city every year, drawing tens of millions of viewers to watch young men find out which team they're about to play for. A process the league once ran quietly in a hotel ballroom is now one of its biggest annual television properties in its own right. Still, through the 1940s, professional football remained a distant second to college football in the American sports imagination. That wouldn't change until television entered the picture. On December 28, 1958, the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants played in the NFL championship game at Yankee Stadium, and it went to overtime, the first sudden death overtime game in league history. Millions of people watched it on television, in a country where television sets had only recently become a fixture in the average living room. That single game is often credited as the moment professional football proved it could be genuinely great television. Contained action, natural drama, a ticking clock. Football, unlike baseball, fit perfectly into the rhythms of a broadcast, with built-in breaks for commercials and a season short enough that every single game actually mattered. Pete Rozelle became commissioner in 1960, and he understood television better than any commissioner in any sport at that point in history. His single biggest move was convincing all the team owners to pool their television rights together and split the money evenly, instead of each team negotiating its own local deal. Big market teams like the Giants had every incentive to keep that money for themselves. Rozelle convinced them to share it anyway, arguing that a stronger league made every team, including the biggest ones, more valuable in the long run. That principle, shared national television revenue, is still the financial foundation the entire league sits on today. In 1961, Congress passed the Sports Broadcasting Act, explicitly allowing leagues to negotiate television deals collectively without running into antitrust problems. Rozelle had lobbied hard for exactly that exemption. Without it, the entire model of shared national broadcast revenue might have been illegal. By the mid-1960s, the NFL had a real problem. A rival league, the American Football League, had launched in 1960 and was stealing top talent by simply outbidding NFL teams for star players straight out of college. A bidding war that expensive threatened to bankrupt both leagues at once. In 1966, the two leagues agreed to merge, a deal that took years to formally complete, and included a new annual exhibition between each league's champion. That exhibition became the Super Bowl. The very first one, played in January 1967, didn't even sell out, and tickets could be bought for around $10. Compare that to today, where a single 30-second commercial during the Super Bowl costs roughly $8 million, and the game routinely draws well over 100 million live viewers, the single largest audience in American television nearly every single year it airs. The merger gave the NFL something invaluable, a monopoly on major professional football in America. No serious rival league has threatened it since, and every subsequent attempt from the USFL in the 1980s to the XFL decades later has either folded or been absorbed into a minor developmental role. For most of its history, NFL players had almost no leverage. There was no free agency in any meaningful sense. A player was tied to whichever team drafted him year after year, with little ability to negotiate for his actual market value. That system finally broke in the early 1990s after a string of lawsuits and a brief, ugly player strike in 1987 that saw teams field replacement rosters made up of non-union players for several weeks. In 1993, the league and the players' union reached a landmark agreement: real free agency for players, in exchange for a hard salary cap that limited how much any single team could spend on its roster in a given year. That trade-off is the single most important business decision in the league's modern history. The salary cap did two things at once. It kept player costs from spiraling out of control the way they eventually did in some other sports, and it created something close to genuine competitive parity, since even the richest owner in the league couldn't simply outspend everyone else for talent. A small market team like Green Bay could, in theory, compete on a level field with a big market team like the Cowboys, because both were bound by the same spending ceiling. The cap has climbed enormously since then. It sat around $143 million per team as recently as the 2015 season. It's projected to exceed $300 million per team for the upcoming season, more than double in roughly a decade, tracking directly alongside the league's exploding media revenue. If the salary cap explains how the money gets distributed, television explains where all the money actually comes from in the first place. Through the 1990s and 2000s, the NFL's broadcast deals kept climbing, with Fox entering the picture in 1994 and outbidding CBS for the NFC package entirely. A moment that shocked the broadcast industry and proved just how much networks were willing to pay to have football on their schedule. Every renewal cycle after that followed the same pattern: bigger numbers, more networks competing, and the league squeezing more value out of every package. By the early 2020s, the NFL had signed media rights agreements worth almost $110 billion over 11 years, with CBS, NBC, Fox, ESPN, and Amazon, more than double the value of the deals it replaced. Under that agreement, CBS, Fox, and NBC each pay an average of over $2 billion a year, while ESPN pays roughly $2.7 billion annually for Monday Night Football and the right to eventually broadcast the Super Bowl. Then the league started slicing off pieces of its inventory to streaming platforms on top of those traditional deals. Amazon pays more than $1 billion a season for exclusive Thursday Night Football streaming rights. Netflix entered the picture in 2024, paying to broadcast NFL games on Christmas Day. The league has also sold individual streaming packages piecemeal, including Christmas Day games and wild card playoff games, worth well over $100 million apiece. Even Sunday Ticket, the out-of-market package that used to belong to DirecTV, moved to YouTube in a deal reportedly worth $2 billion annually. Combined, all of this media revenue now adds up to somewhere around $12 billion a year, just from broadcast and streaming rights alone. And the league deliberately built opt-out clauses into these contracts, giving itself the leverage to renegotiate even earlier than scheduled if a better deal comes along. Total league revenue crossed $23 billion for the most recent fiscal year, and Commissioner Roger Goodell has set a public target of $25 billion annually within the next couple of years. All of that television money flows directly into what a franchise is actually worth, and the numbers have gotten almost absurd. The average NFL franchise was valued at roughly $7 billion in 2025, up 20% from the year before, and double what it was worth just 4 years earlier. 3 teams now exceed $10 billion in value: the Dallas Cowboys, the Los Angeles Rams, and the New York Giants, with the Cowboys sitting at the very top of the list, worth roughly $13 billion and generating more operating profit in a single season than almost any other sports franchise on the planet. Even the lowest valued team in the entire league is still worth more than the vast majority of major sports franchises anywhere else in the world. Part of what's driving those numbers even higher is a decision the league made in 2024. Allowing approved private equity firms to buy small minority stakes in franchises for the first time in league history.
Owners have just voted to approve a rule allowing a portion of NFL franchises to be sold to private equity firms.
A handful of firms committed billions of dollars in capital to take stakes of up to 10% in individual teams, giving owners a new way to cash out some of their equity without giving up control of the team itself, and giving Wall Street its first real entry point into NFL ownership. That demand has gotten so intense that investors who can't afford to buy into the NFL or NBA anymore are now bidding up valuations in smaller leagues instead, just to get any kind of exposure to professional sports ownership. The NFL didn't just become valuable. It became so valuable that it reshaped the economics of sports investing everywhere beneath it. The league isn't stopping at American borders either. The NFL has steadily expanded its international games program, moving beyond its old habit of playing occasional games in London and Toronto into regular games in Germany, Spain, Brazil, and Ireland, with more countries added to the rotation nearly every year. Every one of the league's 32 teams is now part of a formal global markets program spanning more than 20 countries, a deliberate strategy to build fan bases and eventually revenue streams well outside the United States. The logic is simple. Domestic television revenue, as enormous as it already is, has a ceiling. International expansion is one of the last remaining growth levers left to pull if the league wants to keep climbing toward that $25 billion target and beyond. Television and franchise values get most of the attention, but the league has spent decades building revenue streams underneath all of it that most fans barely notice. Stadiums are one of the biggest. Modern NFL venues aren't just football fields anymore. They're year-round entertainment complexes, hosting concerts, other sporting events, corporate functions, and premium hospitality suites that rent for staggering sums. Teams have gotten remarkably good at getting cities and states to help foot the bill for these buildings, often through public bonds or tax incentives, arguing that a new stadium will pay for itself in local economic activity. Whether that argument actually holds up has been debated by economists for years, but it hasn't stopped the stadium boom. Personal seat licenses, a one-time fee fans pay just for the right to buy season tickets in certain sections, have become their own quiet revenue machine, sometimes generating hundreds of millions of dollars for a single new building before a single game is ever played there. Then there's gambling. For most of the league's history, the NFL treated sports betting as something to keep at arm's length, worried about anything that could taint the integrity of the game. That changed fast after a 2018 Supreme Court decision struck down the federal law that had effectively banned sports betting outside Nevada. Once states started legalizing betting one by one, the NFL flipped its entire posture, signing official partnerships with sportsbooks, integrating betting odds directly into broadcasts, and building an entire ecosystem of betting-adjacent content that simply didn't exist a decade earlier. Betting doesn't just generate direct sponsorship dollars for the league, it also drives enormous engagement, since a fan with money on a game watches every single snap far more closely than a casual viewer ever would. Merchandise and licensing add another steady layer on top of everything else. Jerseys, sponsorship logos stitched onto uniforms since 2022, video game licensing, and a direct-to-consumer streaming product in NFL Plus that the league built specifically to control more of its own distribution instead of relying entirely on outside networks. None of these pieces individually rival the size of the national television deals, but stacked together, they've turned the NFL into a business with revenue coming from nearly every direction at once. Media, real estate, gambling, merchandise, and now private equity, all reinforcing the same core product, a limited supply of 32 teams that isn't getting any bigger anytime soon. That scarcity is, in the end, part of the whole equation. Unlike a company that can expand production to meet demand, the NFL has capped its own supply at 32 franchises for decades, with no real expansion on the horizon. Demand for ownership, media rights, and sponsorship keeps climbing every year, while the number of teams available to sell those rights stays exactly the same. That mismatch, more than any single television contract, might be the simplest explanation for why the valuations keep going up and refuse to come back down. So here's the actual arc. A $100 franchise fee paid inside a car dealership showroom in 1920. Teams that couldn't make payroll and folded within a season. A championship game moved indoors because of a blizzard. A commissioner who convinced the richest owners in the league to share their television money with the poorest ones. A merger that saved two leagues from bankrupting each other. A labor war that produced the salary cap. And a media rights arms race that's now worth more every single year than most companies are worth in their entire existence. $200 billion in combined franchise value. $23 billion a year in revenue and climbing. 100 million people watching a single game on a random Sunday in February. None of that was inevitable. It was built, decade by decade, deal by deal, by a league that started so broke it couldn't even find a real office to meet in.